All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to PPAN's February webinar titled Native Plants and Permaculture. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful to have expert speaker Amy Scanes-Wolfe here with us. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Manager for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually host a monthly event, so be sure to sign up for our e-news and check our events calendar to stay up to date with all of our upcoming events. We have got a great session prepared for you, but first we just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. So we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. So we do a lot of grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy, community mobilization, and habitat creation. A good example of that would be the Protect Our Pollinators Habitat Fund, which is based on the sales of the pollinator license plate, and that goes towards creating pollinator safe spaces in Colorado while also promoting community mobilization. So like I said, we have Amy Scanes-Wolfe with us here today. It's actually her third PPAN webinar, so thank you so much, Amy. So Amy's had a colorful decade-long background in regenerative farming, ecological landscaping, horticulture, historical interpretation, running educational programming, and organizational development. Amy is deeply passionate about creating pathways to reconnect people to their ecosystems and food systems. She is currently the executive director of the Niwot Homestead, which is a project dedicated to relying on the power of community to cultivate a complete diet in a way that honors our ecosystem. She also teaches permaculture at Naropa and with Boulder Permaculture. And if you are curious to learn even more about how to garden and grow food in a way that supports people and planet alike, past this webinar, the Boulder Permaculture Design course is open for registration. Like we said, Amy is an instructor, and we can put a link in the chat for people to check that out. And so native plants, permaculture, and pollinators all play a key role in supporting healthy ecosystems. And by working with nature, we can create more resilient landscapes, protect biodiversity, and strengthen our food systems. And before we get started, and as a reminder, please stay muted. Leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. We are recording this presentation and we'll post it to our YouTube, and we'll send out a link for that as well in the follow-up. We also encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. These donations will go towards our advocacy, habitat creation, and education efforts. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. Another way to support the work we do here is by getting a pollinator license plate, which we will also throw that in the chat as well. And anyways, I will pass it off to Amy. Thank you all for being here, and thanks, Amy.
Great. Thank you, Anna Gray. Let me go ahead and just screen share here. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here today. Excited to spend the next hour talking a little bit more about this native plants and permaculture topic. Just really quick, wanted to maybe introduce myself a little further and share some of the projects that I'll be kind of pulling examples from or referencing in this as well. And so I actually started my interest in this whole field by studying cultural anthropology at college. I got really fascinated by how much the way we get our food has shaped what our societies look like over time. I left that course of study actually really thinking that I wanted to be a hunter-gatherer, but that felt like an unrealistic career path at that time. So I started farming instead. kind of fell in love with it. But over the years, I've had a lot of questions come up about our farm systems, and even the ones that felt or were called organic or regenerative, still, when I looked at them, looked nothing like a natural ecosystem. And that started really bothering me. And so I kind of fell into the concept of permaculture way before I saw a living example of it. We'll get into what that is in a moment, but I kind of dabbled in everything from ecological landscaping to working at Harlequin's Gardens, that I'm sure many of you know and love, and finally working with drylands agroecology research. And so I don't actually work with, I'm going to call it DAR for ease. I don't work there anymore, but I am going to pull some examples from their projects just because I'm so inspired by the work that they're doing in this region. In 2020, I posted looking for land on Nextdoor for this actual crazy high school gardening program that was always a bad idea, never would have worked. That fell through, but this lovely couple had responded to the ad, Rod and Barb, and they offered me use of their 1.5 acre big suburban backyard. And so what started as a personal vegetable garden has kind of grown into this whole community run project that I'll also pull some examples from. But we call that the Niwot Homestead. And then finally, as Anna Gray mentioned, all of this is kind of grounded in this permaculture design philosophy that I learned and teach with Boulder Permaculture. So just wanted to frame that a little bit. But I think the first question we really land on here is, what is permaculture? And I think that even if you asked 20 different permaculture practitioners for their definition, it would probably be a little different. There's some ambiguity in what people call permaculture. You've probably heard it come up in a lot of different ways. But just to share the story of how it actually began as a word, that guy on the right over there, Bill Mollison, was an Australian guy. This was in the 1970s. He was actually observing marsupials in the habitat in Australia and noticing how deeply woven and meshed and adapted they were to that place. And he started asking himself, why is it that humans are not that way? And then he realized, actually, wait, the indigenous people in Australia live just that way, with this beautiful, seamless weaving with their ecosystem. And so he started asking, what are the actual principles and patterns and ethics that you need to live in a way that does actually integrate with and support your ecosystem as a human? And what he landed on was this concept of permaculture, which is a fancy word for how humans have been living for most of human history. And so I see it as a toolkit for how can we rediscover how to live in harmony with ecosystems as a part of ecosystems. And I'm not going to labor these principles or ethics today, but I just did want to flash up briefly that permaculture is grounded in this kind of collection of design principles and ethics that you see. And for our purposes, I really actually want to dive into one particular ethic, which is the ethic of obtain a yield. I think that one of the biggest issues plaguing us in society right now is that we're so disconnected from the impact of our lives on the earth that we can't make good decisions anymore about it. I think if most people knew what it actually took to put food on their plate, they wouldn't eat that food. They'd be horrified by it. But what we have done is we've broken our feedback loops so much that we can no longer really understand, in order for me to eat, what has to happen to the earth. And I wanted to show these two pictures down here because on the left, you see this is the kind of tall grass prairie oak savanna that much of our current farmland used to be in the US. On the right is more or less what it looks like today. And so I think it can be really easy for us to have a huge emphasis on what the landscapes directly around our home look like and put a huge amount of care into preserving and restoring them, while simultaneously the way that we're living is actually completely obliterating an ecosystem somewhere else. And I think when I grew up, I was really asked the question, or told that my way of relating to nature was leave no trace. But the fact is, we are leaving a huge trace because we're alive and we get to choose what that trace is. But right now, we just don't see it. And so to me, the biggest question that permaculture is kind of looking at is, how do we get to see the impact of our lives and be in relationship with ecosystems? And again, for many years of my life, even before I was a farmer, sometimes adjacent to, I was a big plant nerd. I still love nothing better than going hiking in the hills and observing and looking at nature's patterns. But I kind of like this analogy that to be in a relationship with a place, you actually have to depend on it. There has to be a give and take both ways. And so to me, observing nature is like watching a TV show. I love it. I go out there. It's fun. I have a favorite character, which in my case might be flax, because I love that plant. But I feel like when you're actually depending on an ecosystem for your food and your sustenance and your livelihood and your shelter, your whole perspective starts changing and you notice changes way better. You have an actual kind of like give and take where you feel like the landscape is gifting you and you're gifting it back. And so I think to me, a big piece of what we're looking at is how do we actually have relationship with ecosystem, not just be an observer of it. And that kind of ties into me where permaculture sits as the biggest question that permaculture can really answer is in ecologies we've already altered beyond recognition, places that are no longer intact wild relationships of organisms. How can we create new ecosystems that meet our needs and function like healthy wild ecologies? By doing all those good things like supporting biodiversity and sequestering carbon and restoring water cycles. And I just wanted to give two examples of this on the right here. The first picture is actually a waterway before and after a beaver dam is put in. And I think to me, if we can be good humans, we can play the beaver. Because what the beaver does is in a landscape that otherwise this water is just kind of coming through relatively fast, when they build a dam in that sort of place or an analog of that dam, that water is going to spread way out and start infiltrating and create this whole new habitat and ecosystem where plants can thrive that couldn't thrive before. They are completely transforming the landscape. It's not the same as it was before, but they're enabling more biodiversity and life because of that. And I think that's a really nice segue into the work of Elk Run Farm. And so some of you may have been up there, but this is the pilot site for drylands agroecology research. Really quick backstory, Nick DiDomenico was trying to farm this land. In 2015, his family got a hold of it. It's actually about 14 acres. It has a well capable of irrigating less than an acre of the property. Most of the property was completely devegetated, sloping hillside, eroded. He reached out for advice to the NRCS about how to actually restore this land to a place where they could farm it. And the NRCS basically told him, you can't. There's no tool that we have in our toolbook to help you regenerate land this degraded to make it farmable. And so this whole place kind of became an experiment. And how do you really restore deeply degraded land without water in this bioregion? And what you're looking at here is just kind of the heart of it, which is what's called a forest garden. We'll talk about that a little more in a moment. But we do insect biodiversity research out there, or we did when I was a part of it. They still do. And one of the amazing things to note is we would count the number of honeybees and the number of different native pollinator species in each of the farm systems and the adjacent open space. The number of native pollinators in this garden was more than 10x the amount in the open space control. And so although this doesn't actually look like a wild Colorado landscape would have 200 years ago, a space has been created that not only feeds people an extraordinary amount of food, it also supports a lot of native biodiversity in different ways than were there before, but there's kind of a win-win there. So I just kind of wanted to frame that as the question that I think permaculture can answer best. In human environments, how do we support humans and native wildlife together? And again, like I said, this is not new. I think of it as a toolkit for us who have forgotten how to belong to an ecosystem to rediscover it. So getting into this question of what is a native plant, I kind of poked around a little bit just to see what different people were saying. And this was the definition that I came to on the Colorado Native Plant Society website. A native plant is a plant species that occurs naturally in a particular region, state, ecosystem, and habitat without direct or indirect human actions. Just really quick, because in a way I find that definition a little bit challenging, I wanted to flash up this book that I suspect many of you have read. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. But Robin Wall Kimmerer kind of has reconciled indigenous wisdom with kind of a PhD in botany and it looks at these two things together. And one of the focal point plants of her book is sweetgrass, which has been used for hundreds of years by many peoples in the US ceremonially. And she did a study to figure out, okay, if we actually have controls where humans aren't touching the sweetgrass, where we're using it via traditional methods, which one does it thrive with more? And basically, she found out that this braiding sweetgrass, the plant actually struggles and fails to thrive and dies out of the ecosystem if humans aren't tending it. And I think what's really beautiful about that is just thinking about the ways in which humans have related to plants in North America for thousands of years and co-evolved with them. And so I think to say that humans can only be effective by not impacting a landscape is maybe a slightly different perspective than permaculture often holds. But I much prefer, I think, this other definition that I found from the Conservation Foundation, which is that plants that have been growing in an area prior to European settlement is maybe an interesting bar. Talk about that in a sec. But also plants that have evolved and adapted to our local environments for thousands of years. And I think what's really potent about that is that when we start thinking about native plants, we're thinking about relationships, not absolutes. And so there may be a way in which some plants that came here after European settlement actually do weave into this landscape over time. But when a plant instantly arrives, there's no relationship there. And so I think the beauty of native plants by that definition is their deep adaptation to this place, the way in which they feed and relate with native insects and wildlife and other plants, and that cultural heritage of how humans have depended on these plants over time, which is really woven into our story and sense of belonging. And so rolling with that definition for a moment, once you start thinking about plants native to Boulder County, it ends up becoming a little bit of a complicated picture because Boulder County is a pretty diverse place. And if you're going to take a plant from the high alpine mountains of Colorado and stick it on the prairie, it's not going to be very happy and it might not have a lot of the functions of nativeness that are helpful to us. And so we'll kind of talk through some of these plant communities a little more in a moment. But just to kind of share three very different conditions that exist in Boulder County. One is these plants that live in riparian areas. One is these kind of prairie plant communities that are a little more drought adapted. And third are the montane forest plants that are sitting at a kind of cooler, higher, wetter environment. And so I also want to just note this last kind of cohort of plants that we'll come back to. I've never heard them given this name. Maybe there is a scientific name for them out here somewhere, but one of the things that's happened in Boulder County in the last 150 years is we have created ecologies that never used to exist here. When you think of Walden Ponds, when you think of Pella Crossing, these are places of standing water that literally didn't exist on the plains. And so this whole new cohort of plants has showed up to fill niches. And the reason they've showed up is because these niches do exist out east. They're basically slightly eastern range plants that have crept west in their range because we have new types of habitat that they fill really well. I think many of us know that the bald eagle is a bird that was way fewer in number before, but we celebrate its existence here now because there's more water to support it. And so the way I kind of want to frame this as we keep talking here is looking at native not as an absolute, like being a native plant is great, but actually at a collection of relationships. We're not trying to copy a plant, we're trying to copy an ecosystem. How do we copy that riparian ecosystem? How do we copy that prairie ecosystem? How do we make sure the relationships between all those beings are intact? Because just to share an example of probably the most iconic native animal species around here, the bison, I have seen landscapes that bison have completely degraded because the way that they were being managed on that land no longer looked like it used to. And so it's not that the bison restores land, it's that the bison in relationship with the grass and the predators and the water cycles and the pathways restores land. And so to me, this is actually a very helpful way of thinking about it, because what we start looking at is actually communities, not just plants, but the communities of plants that exist. This concept of the guild is something you'll come across a lot in permaculture. And I'm just going to harp for about 1 or 2 minutes on this slide, even though these are not strictly native plants, because I think it's such a beautiful illustration of relationship. But the concept of a guild is, how do you create a collection of plants that are not working competitively with each other? So maybe you have a plant that actually really loves shade tucked into the north side, and the sun-loving plants are sitting on the south, and every layer from vine to ground cover to canopy is filled with some plant. And maybe the root systems of those plants are quite different. Maybe you have a taproot plant and a rhizome plant and a fibrous root system plant, and they're actually not competing under the soil. And even better, how can these plants support each other? And just to give one really specific example, if any of you are home apple gardeners, this is an apple tree on the right here, you'll notice that those apples often have little holes in them. The insect that usually does that is the codling moth larva. There is a wasp that will parasitize that larva, and that wasp is attracted by plants in the carrot family, big umbellflower plants. And so theoretically, if you put carrot family plants under your apple tree, you don't have pests. You don't have holes in your apples. I had heard that for years, and just one time in my homestead property over here, there was an explosion of wild carrots sitting under these old apple trees, really big fruit year, not a single hole in those apples. Other side of the property covered in holes. And so when we now design guilds in our forest garden, this is an apple tree, we have an abundance of fennel over here and a plant called sweet cecily underneath that's also in the carrot family, and this whole polyculture of plants that support the health, so that we sometimes say in permaculture solutions are additive. If you're having a pest problem, don't try and eradicate the pest, add an element to bring it back into balance. And it's kind of interesting because I know so many relationships in culinary plants that I've grown that are like that, ways in which they work really well together. But when I sat down to actually think about it, I'm much less aware of those relationships in our native ecologies because, again, I don't interact with them. I don't have a relationship where I'm harvesting with them all the time and watching and tracking in that way. And so I think that's kind of an invitation as we start using more native plants in our landscapes to actually watch and see how those relationships play out. But just to give a very light example, here's a collection of plants that I see growing in the riparian areas around my house, all native plants to this region. It's really cool to look that nature has basically assembled a guild this way. We have the cottonwood overstory. What we know is that the golden currants love the shade that the cottonwood provides, and it makes them able to be a little more drought resilient. We see the chokecherry in the same way, really loving that understory. And the great thing about the chokecherry is that all these birds come and sit on it, and then they poop useful seeds out below and a whole bunch of fertilizer, which also benefits the cottonwood. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks a lot about the relationship between goldenrod and aster, that typically this Porter's aster is actually kind of white with the lightest purple hue. But she pointed out that goldenrod is a vivid yellow and asters typically is a purple, grow together because it makes both of them stand out better to insects. And I see these two growing in association all the time in our ditch areas. Wild licorice is a nitrogen fixer, so is actually bringing fertility to that whole collection of plants. And so I think what's really important to think about is you can take any one of these plants and put it in your garden. That's great. I've done that too. But vastly more potent than that is to actually understand how are these plants supporting and relating to each other, and to maybe transplant that whole community into your garden, knowing that they're supporting each other in really potent ways. And when we look at nature in this way, we could also say that a lot of these are really useful edible plants that we might want to have in our guild and in our garden to eat or to use as medicine. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. But just really honing in again on the sense of like, how do we actually copy communities and relationships between plants here? And so to me, the most powerful and easy way on a pattern level to look at plant communities is, where do they fit in ecological succession? And we live in a really beautiful and amazing place that allows us to see this very clearly, because on the left, we have this progression that nature tends to follow, where you have usually some sort of disturbance, and your annual weedy crops show up first. And if you give them long enough, they create the right habitat and the right conditions for perennial grasses and weeds to show up. And then it moves to shrubs, and then it moves to softwoods, and then these hardwood forests. The main thing that limits this progression is water. And so as you walk up into our foothills and then mountains, we get wetter and wetter and wetter, and we basically get to walk through ecological succession as we go up. And at every phase, we have a different, as they call it, climax community, a collection of plants that's adapted to be kind of the stable community of plants at that phase. And so if we can understand as home gardeners which phase we're trying to actually copy in our gardens, that gives us a whole lot of clues about which plants to put in, what they might want, how they're going to exist together in community. And so I've kind of tracked on the right here the actual plant communities that we have in this region along this ecological succession line from our annual pioneers. A lot of people really don't like this community of plants, and I'm actually not going to harp on it a lot here because I think as a lot of home gardeners, the closest we may get to this is trying to be a vegetable gardener to perpetuate annuals. But the things that these plants are really good at are getting to ground fast that's been deserved, covering it, being nature's band-aid, as Wendell Berry says. And then setting the stage for the next generation of plants. Some of our natives, of course, here are sunflowers. I've noticed that the prickly poppy, if any of you are familiar with that plant, is actually one of the plants that finds this disturbed niche really well around here. Plants like lamb's quarter that some people consider weeds, also a native, that's what fits in this niche. But vastly more helpful to us when we're actually designing a landscape is probably going to be one of these other communities. Shortgrass prairie, shrubland, ponderosa forest, kind of upper aspen forest, and then alongside all of those riparian areas. So our first question that we're going to kind of be asking if we're looking at this as a pattern for design is, which climax community am I trying to recreate? Some of the things you might ask about that: first, your goals. Are you trying to shade your house? Shortgrass prairie might not be the best way to do that. You probably are going to be looking at a more forest ecosystem if you're looking for shade. Are you trying to grow your whole diet? That's the question that we're asking through my project in Niwot, and that puts a whole different set of questions in the mix because what we're now looking for is calories more than anything else. Are you trying to just have some plants you can harvest medicine from? And so we'll go over in a moment some of the plants that fit each of these communities. But the first question you're probably going to want to think about is, what are you trying to get from the landscape? Second, water. Do you have enough water to push your landscape beyond shortgrass prairie, or do you not? If you do you have enough to push it into a riparian area plant community or not? And we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. And finally, what tools and methods do you have to manage your landscape? If you're looking for a really low maintenance landscape, that looks very different than if you're willing to be out there every day tending to it and kind of perhaps filling the niche of some animals that would do that in an ecosystem, but that aren't there. And we're just going to go briefly now through each of these types of ecosystem to look at some of the plants that might show up there and kind of the conditions that you would need to recreate them. When I started my landscaping business, I was really, really excited about trying to create prairie meadows in people's backyards. We did a whole lot of that. We planted a bunch of native grasses. We tore out turf. We replaced it with kind of native forages and such. And for a couple of years, landscapes were pretty spectacular. Just in terms of the abundance of wildflowers, the grass is taking off. But what I've noticed over time is grass actually doesn't do very well if it doesn't have somebody eating it. And we copy that a little bit with the lawnmower. But our prairie ecosystems were so deeply shaped by ruminants and grass eaters coming over and both fertilizing and trampling and munching those grasses down and getting rid of all that dead vegetative matter that grasses tend to stockpile above ground. That to actually copy the patterning of shortgrass prairie in a backyard can't, in my opinion, very easily be done well. I think its biggest application in the food world is regenerative grazing, regenerative ranching, that really tries to copy the patterns of wild ruminants. in order to establish really diverse grassland. That said, we can probably pull certain plants out of this context that may be useful for our food and our landscapes, and understand that we can't really copy the relationships that used to be there. But because many of us live on the plains, we're still going to be supporting some of the native pollinators, and they're still going to be adapted to our water schemes. And so just to highlight a few of my favorite plants from this bioregion, plants that tend to do well with little to no water around here. The first is native flax. When we're looking at the question of how to actually cultivate a complete diet around here, one of the biggest gaps or challenges is in oily seeds and nuts, because there's not many that grow natively here. And one of my great curiosities has been, can we actually cultivate perennial flax varieties at large enough scale to feed ourselves flaxseed, which would be incredible. And we've just started planting and trialing that a little bit with my project, though it's pretty young. But regardless, that seed is not quite as productive as annual flax that you'd get at the grocery store, but nevertheless produces a really nutritious seed that you do need to cook to make it edible, and is a wonderful kind of late spring blooming plant. Our prairie goldenrod, which is the stiff goldenrod, is one that we've used in medicinal uses quite often. You can dry the aerial leaves and flower bits, and it's a really nice immune boosting sort of herb, pretty potent. So we put a little bit in some of our tea blends. Prickly pear cactus is one that I'm guessing a lot of home gardeners might not be delighted to put in their landscape, but certainly very drought resilient and delicious edible fruit. In general, I don't love talking theoretically about plants I don't have a lot of experience with. So most of the plants I'm going to feature in every case here are ones I've actually planted. I put a little asterisk next to the ones I haven't. This is called a prairie turnip, which you might be able to tell from the leaf is a nice nitrogen fixing plant. The native plains tribes around here relied on it very heavily as a staple crop, the sort of plant that when you found a grove of it, you could derail a bison hunt because digging this up was more important. And so really important starchy staple, have done many experiments in propagating it, and it's very finicky to propagate. I think it's one of those kind of ones that relies on the relationships of the shortgrass prairie to actually establish well, but just kind of thinking about food in a prairie context. And then, of course, our prairie rose is a really tough, lovely edible whose rose hips actually have 3 times the vitamin C of an wrong way around. 3 rose hips have as much vitamin C as an orange. So a really potent winter medicine, winter tea, even winter kind of food source as well. So shifting past shortgrass prairie, the vast majority of us live in a landscape that looks like this picture on the left. And what's really cool to think about with that is if we say our annual rainfall is about 16 inches a year, we know that pretty much the only phase of succession you get to with that much water is grassland. However, if you imagine every single roof and driveway and road and hardscape in a landscape like this actually running into the landscape, you can now basically double the rainfall that falls on your land. You just went to 32 inches of water on that land in your backyard per year. And if you can store it there, you can actually push succession further than it would go without irrigating. And that to me is actually the real opportunity and value in suburbia, is you almost get to say this whole thing becomes riparian habitat if we do it intelligently and we do it thoughtfully. And that's a tremendous boost to our ecologies, especially knowing that it's a little bit easier to actually copy riparian patterning in suburbia than maybe shortgrass prairie patterning. Just to give an example of this on a much larger scale, this is Elk Run Farm again. This is the landscape here on the left that was devegetated when they got there. There wasn't almost a scrap of vegetation growing on this land. And so as a technique to try and regenerate it, basically what they did is they dug what's called a contour swale. Basically imagine on the level line of a landscape where water is tending to run down a hill, you instead dig this basin and then a berm. And on that level line, as water comes down, it hits that and it completely infiltrates. And using that moist, wet microclimate, they planted about 1,000 trees in this landscape, knowing they'd never be able to irrigate them after day one. People thought they were a little nuts. Many years later, though, we're still looking at just under an 80% survival rate on those trees. And so a really cool example of how to actually push succession a little bit further than water management, knowing that these trees are apples and pears and really valuable food producing plants that are also going to further cool the landscape and produce an amazing habitat for diverse insects that maybe wouldn't be present in the grasslands between them. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. So just to feature a few plants and patterns from these types of systems, what we see traditionally in a lot of our plains riparian areas is that you'd get this flush of water early in the year, and then they would go dry later in the season. And so many of these plants are quite adapted to wet and dry, which makes them really well suited to catching the water from your roof. A lot of these forests are sunlit. They're not a dense closed canopy forest. They have all of these edges along with the grassland that let sun in. And so they really provide a lot of cool opportunities for us to grow food. And so just to feature a couple of my favorite plants that grow there that have good edible use, on the left is the golden currant. To me, those currants are actually better than any cultivated currant that I've eaten. Admittedly, a little bit variable depending on the conditions, but really nice early blooming shrub understory plant that's shade tolerant. Choke cherry, likewise, kind of understory fruiting plant. You can do a lot with that fruit if you process it a bit. And in a way, my favorite thing about this plant is just that it brings so many birds to your property that poop out even more plants for you, that you kind of have this whole understory of interesting plants rooting, including more currants and Nanking cherries and all sorts of other species. Our wild plum is a pretty solid, delicious plum. I've heard serviceberry referred to as the blueberry of Colorado, the blueberry that will actually grow here. If you've ever eaten one, which might be a little unlikely because the birds tend to get to them very rapidly, they taste very much like a blueberry. Very slow growing plant, but one that you start seeing as you hit just the foothills. They appear in our riparian areas a little bit more. Also an understory plant, and of course our riverbank grape. So just to give a few examples of native plants that fill those fruiting niches really well. The next layer or kind of habitat of plants is those understory plants. And again, just to feature a few of our native ones that I really love for this kind of niche. The first is the Maximilian sunflower. Many of us have eaten the very close cousin of this plant, which is called the sunchoke or the Jerusalem artichoke. It's a sunflower that has a big starchy tuberous root. The Maximilian sunflower roots are smaller than a sunchoke, but still quite edible. And there's such what's the right word? Analogs ecologically that truly you could sub one for the other with and have a very similar ecological niche if you would rather lean into having a sunchoke. They're native just slightly east of here. Anise hyssop is a lovely medicinal herb, really good for gut health, digestion. This Canada goldenrod, which needs a little bit more water and grows much bigger than the other goldenrod I showed, also great for immune health. Our wild licorice, the root of that plant is very medicinal, also good for gut health. And then our hops, native hops, which most of us probably are familiar with in beer, but they're also nice in a tea as a sedative. I say they're nice. I actually hate them personally. I can't stand the flavor of hops, but many people like hops in a tea blend as a kind of calming sedative plant. I'm going to go pretty quickly here because we're actually running out of time fast, but just to kind of go up slightly into our Ponderosa foothills. I bet a whole bunch of you have walked past this three-leaf sumac plant on foothills hikes, and I am curious how many of you have eaten it. But those berries, if you just stick them in the back of your mouth on your tongue, are extremely citrusy. And people actually used to soak them to make lemonade out of them. And when I'm planting like hedgerows where I know there's not going to be a lot of water, this is one of my favorite plants because it's tough as nails. It's the shrub that is kind of most likely to survive in a prairie ecosystem. And those fruits can also be ground into a seasoning powder, really cool bioregional kind of novelty seasoning and food. Our wax currant is a little bit less palatable than the golden currant, but still edible and tasty. The Oregon grape, creeping Oregon grape, probably familiar to many of us as well. I love this for really shady, dry niches, which can be hard to fill in the garden. These fruits, after a frost, become quite palatable. Again, this Indian biscuit root is not one that I've played with propagating myself, so I didn't want to put too much emphasis on it. But as you can probably tell, it's in the carrot family, and the root was a starchy staple that many people depended on historically as a storage starch. And then finally, our narrow leaf echinacea, which you see at a little higher altitude, but very powerful medicinal herb as well for immune health. And then finally, I'm not going to actually focus much on this because the farther up ecological succession you go, the more complex relationships and the more kind of undisturbed woven soil systems you need to support those types of plants, which also means that they're quite difficult to propagate a lot of times. And so many of the plants that are highly medicinal and edible in a forest ecology are ones that are also a little bit hard to get going as a home gardener. Things like osha, which is such a powerful medicinal that it was pretty much harvested out of a lot of our ecosystems when there was not much restriction over people doing that. But just to give a kind of profile of some of the edible plants from that region, probably the easiest one to imagine cultivating is the elderberry, which I love as an understory in wetter spots in our farm systems as well. And then finally, this kind of new niche of eastern plants whose range is creeping west because our landscapes are changing. And I see many of these plants around places like Pella Crossing and such. One is the hackberry. It's actually in the same family as it's the cannabis family. Kind of an interesting fun fact. Produces these tiny, tiny little berries that most people would not consider food. However, when you suck on them, they are like the best candy in the world. And they might have the tiniest film of edibility on them, but they also feed a whole lot of wildlife that again brings you seeds. And I've never tried this, but I've heard that many native people actually used to mash the seed pit and the like fruit periphery together and make kind of a paste out of that. And then sometimes even a milk. The mulberries that have shown up here and are an unbelievably drought resilient, delicious fruit. The American hazelnut, this range is definitely peripheral for, but just from a diet perspective, finding nut trees that are capable of growing is a tremendous source of calories and storage and a really beautiful perennial staple crop. And so I kind of have been playing with planting them in certain places to see if even I plant 100, if 2 of them are great and live, we'll propagate from those and get good genetics for this region. And maybe one day my children at least will have hazelnuts in abundance. And then the final one that I wanted to note was just the bur oak. And although that acorn is not super edible for humans without processing the tannins out of it, very high application for like pig systems and livestock systems, and if you process it, human food as well. The true Colorado native oak tends to be the Gamble oak. And interestingly, that acorn is actually the only one low enough in tannins that you can eat it without processing it as a human food. I'm also really curious about that as a shrub, but I just feel like I have not seen it thriving in many places in Boulder County. It seems like it really prefers the Western Slope bioregion to here. And so, yeah, I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. So if you're really excited to get a little bit more into this, as people mentioned, we do run this permaculture design course. It's 1 weekend a month, April through October, and we would be delighted to get you a $100 discount having attended this webinar. So the discount code's down there for checkout if you want it, and happy to talk about that more if people have questions. But did just want to mention that if you're really excited to get further into permaculture, that is an opportunity. And I think we will now go ahead and open it to questions for the last 10 minutes or so. I'm going to stop
Great.
sharing here.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was wonderful. I especially liked the part at the beginning when you were talking about leaving no trace, but just deciding which trace we leave. I thought that was really powerful. So thank you for that whole presentation. It was wonderful. And we can go and start with questions. So we have here someone is trying to establish native grass in their front yard. They have a big yard. It's not practical to plant grown plants, so they decided to grow from seeds, but are having a hard time getting them to germinate and grow. They think one problem could be deer, which we had some other comments about deer as well. Another problem could be water or temperatures being too low. And do you have any suggestions for establishing native grass and for keeping deer away, I guess, too?
Yeah, so I guess again, so much of this, like on a pattern level, is understanding what are the conditions in a native grassland where native grasses would be germinating and how do you copy that? And I've played with that just a little bit, so I'm not kind of I don't know your conditions well enough to give you an answer specific to your place, but some of the things that I would think about are mostly native grasses don't germinate in bare soil. The perennial grasses are a second generation species. They're come after the colonizers. So I've had way better luck seeding native grasses along with a nurse plant. Some sort of plant that grows very rapidly, perhaps an annual grass. In the past, I've used some of the native-ish at least wildflowers like the plains coreopsis is one of my favorite, or bee balm, or something that's actually going to hold the ground and anchor it and give it a little bit of shade and a little bit of cover to get going. And so I would recommend probably seeding not just the grass, but something else with it to help it get a little further along in that successionary framework. The other thing you may think about if you are at a scale where it's possible is a straw mulch or something to just keep it a little bit sheltered that way. I have certainly also noticed occasionally flocks of birds descending to eat new grass seeds that get put down. So I don't know if that could be a thing in your area. Um, so those are some initial thoughts. As for keeping deer away, um, I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because we're creating exactly the habitat that deer want to live in. So it's kind of a paradoxical thing to then like figure out how to keep them out. Short of actually like fencing or having a dog that's outside and that kind of thing, I don't have any great suggestions for how to do that while plants establish, other than picking plants deer don't want to eat. But yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We also had something in the chat about whether clover or creeping thyme would be helpful with establishing native grass.
So my thoughts on that, and again, I haven't tried that exact thing, but both of those kind of exist in a slightly different, like they short grass prairie is not what they want to be in ultimately. Clover needs a little bit more water. Creeping thyme ends up being kind of a matted ground cover that doesn't really coexist in grassland as much. So I probably would lean away from those and into things that you would actually find in a native grassland as that first generation of colonizers instead.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question is if you could talk about the technique for using runoff for rainwater harvesting and building berms, like what tools do you need and assessing the landscape and all of that.
Yeah, so I gave an hour-long talk on that last week, and I don't know if I can actually answer it with enough detail to be useful in a quick answer here, but that is posted to the Resource Central website. So just to repeat, the very short answer is that you're kind of looking at like what volume of water falls on your roof in a 1-inch rainstorm, and then sizing your catchment to actually hold that amount of water with an overflow. And you can use an amazing tool called an A-frame level that you can build in your garage to figure out the contours, but I don't think I can probably do justice to that whole process quickly, but I'd refer you to that if you want to know a lot more.
Yes, thank you. Is there a link to that talk at all or any way people could learn more about
Yeah,
that
I
through
can I
you?
can find a link in a moment here. I'll look for it while we get to the next one.
Great. People are also wondering if you can share the course discount code again as well.
Yeah, let me stick it in the chat.
Great, thank you.
And we can send these resources out in our follow-up email.
Yes.
Make sure I get the code right before I give it to everybody. And I'm still looking for that Resource Central link. Do you want to just send the Resource Central link out
Yes, yeah,
afterwards so that I don't
we
have
can
to?
do that.
Okay, cool. I'll find that and send it to you though.
Great, thank you so much. Um, Our next question is if there is a plant guild for Montmorency cherry trees. This person has maggots on theirs when it ripens.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never, so I guess maybe the question even behind that is there a specific plant that attracts the predator of those insects? Um, and in a general way, I've never had that problem, so I haven't observed which predators show up. But if you don't already have those carrot family plants under your fruit tree, as a generalization, they attract a huge number of predatory wasps, who are some of the most effective and helpful predators around here. And so this is, again, a pattern level guess because I've never had that problem myself. But some of those plants that are awesome are like fennel. If you want to go the annual root dill, lovage is another perennial that's really great for that. I'm trying to think what other good ones bloom at the right time. Cherries are a little bit earlier, so you might get away with the sweet cecily in that way. But yeah, that's a particular thing. And in general, a nice way to think about assembling guilds is find plants of a number of different families and stick them together because they tend to bring balance in the insect communities that way. You don't have too many of any one insect because they tend to eat family by family. So the more balance you have, the less pests you have in general. Those are two quick thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another deer question. So someone says, for deer, what about adding plants on the peripheral that they enjoy so they can focus on those plants versus the interior plants, which you would like to save for human use?
Yeah. I mean, I hate speaking from things I haven't done. So I'm speaking here from things I've heard about and not personally done. But I've often heard of people designing a hedge where, like, the outer layer is plants that deer love. And then you have some gnarly, thorny thing that would be really annoying for them to come through as a hedge. And then on the inside of that, you have all the plants that you want. And that way, you're kind of creating a corridor that directs them away. My curiosity with that has always been, how do you establish the plants that the deer really like in the first place without them eating them to the ground? And so maybe that's like I don't know, when I farmed in Virginia, people used to plant crops specifically to attract deer there so they could hunt them. But maybe you put a collection of those annual plants on the outside to bring the deer to first. I don't know. It's something that's worth playing with, but I have not personally done it. So can't speak from experience.
Got it. Thank you. Let's see. I see in the chat we're getting lots of good resources to people. But I'm not seeing any other questions. So people can feel free to put them in the chat if you want.
I will pop in, Amy. I wonder if you could just speak briefly about some of your pollinator monitoring.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we have been doing both originally with DAR, and then we've also been doing it at my Niwot Homestead project, is the question that we're really trying to ask is, insects are such an amazing kind of a way of looking at ecosystem health because they represent all the diversity below them and above them in the food chain, but we're not entomologists. So how can we look at insects and get a picture of ecosystem health in an accessible way? And the way we've currently been doing this is by basically, in every farm treatment that we have a pitfall trap, which bugs kind of fall into, that we leave for 24 hours. And then we also do some netting in a transect next to it. And we basically look at, when we're pulling insects out of those things, what function do those insects have in the ecosystem? That's a little bit oversimplified, but the ones that we're looking at are decomposition, pollination, and being a predator. Because if we know, for example, that there's a ton of predators in the ecosystem, that means there's a lot of prey to support them. We don't have to know what the predators are. We don't have to know who their prey is, but we get that picture of ecosystem health. Likewise, when we're looking at pollinators, we're doing a very simple count of honeybee, native bee, and kind of looking at those two categories to understand, okay, if we're planting these particular plants, which type of pollinators are they supporting? And so what we're hoping to do with that is basically get to this point where we can look at like ratios of function. If we have a ton of decomposers, what does that tell us? If we have a ton of predators, what does that tell us? and make it accessible enough that a layperson who is not an entomologist can learn basic bug patterning and understand what's going on. So that's kind of what we're looking at. It's an evolving study for sure.
Thank you for speaking to that. That's super interesting, and I know we're interested in keeping up with how that goes. But yeah. All right. If there are no other questions, we have about 4 minutes left. But if there are no other questions, I think we can hop off. So thank you so much again, Amy. We really appreciate you being here, and thanks to everyone for joining. And we will send out the follow-up with the recording and other resources as well.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.